I also, of course, want to tell you a little bit about Miriam Shapiro. And I love this photo of her where she almost looks like one of her paintings, like her outfit kind of mirrors her paintings. And what she did with her work is she tried to look like Chicago had at this idea of what were traditionally women's crafts. So things like embroidery and quilting. She uses as a basis for her paintings, sometimes using fragments of quilts and such in the actual paintings, and then sometimes mimicking the idea of that. So, taking the idea of these crafts and kind of turning it into the methodology that she was using and elevating them to a high art. This approach reminds me a lot of pop art, taking the idea of comics and making it high art. Here she's like, well, let me show you some quilting and make it high art. I love the title of this one, Anonymous Was a Woman. So this is a very sort of feminist joke, might you say. When I was in college, I remember this was like the premier feminist joke, was that if you see an artwork and it's anonymous, right? Nobody knows who made it. Well, that was a woman. Um, so again, we know that a lot of unnamed artwork, especially back in more collaborative periods like the medieval, just nobody signed their work at all. But it is sort of a funny note on, anonymous was a woman. Like there are a lot of women artists really up until the Renaissance period that were never going to be recognized because of the way the society was organized, right around artisanship and artisthood, might we say. So again, a few of Shapiro's works. I went to the Orlando Museum of Art recently, and so I took some photos of some Shapiros they have in their collection. And she talked a little bit about, with the one on the left, this idea of the home as the place that the woman was often aligned with. So the canvas kind of looks like a house with a heart inside. And then on the right, she said, women's clothing, right, often has like things like kimonos and such have a link to women's crafting. And she even does pieces like this that use um, kind of props that women are women centric, like the fan. You don't really see men walking around using fans. It's in historical um, sort of uh, historical fashion, right? It's really a woman's thing. So she would use something like a fan again as a basis for making artwork. So I find her pieces very clever, very unique. She's one of the first artists to really think about using the shaped canvas this way, and that led other artists to think about that as well. So very unique stuff. This is Carolyn Schieneman. Her work interior scroll. Schieneman is a performance artist primarily. And so you'll note that as we're getting into this phase of our classroom discussion, that artists often will be of a number of categories. So Schieneman, she's a performance artist, but she's a feminist performance artist. And I introduce her here in feminism rather than in performance because I think that her work, for our purposes of trying to categorize it, it's more about feminism. But notice that sometimes now you'll have these artists that are kind of in multiple categories at the same time. Not to worry. I'm always going to try to consider for like, identification purposes, which one resonates the most. But again, it's you'll notice it's not as easy anymore to classify artists because of this. What is interior scroll? She wrote on a scroll essentially. She rolled it up and then inserted it into her vagina. And during the performance, she pulled it out and began to read from it. It had different statements about women throughout history, and you'll notice she's naked because she's not sexualized, right? So she's naked, and she has this red paint on her to mimic the idea of menstrual blood. As I mentioned, a lot of the essentialists are very in your face, right? They wouldn't have minded kind of shocking you or making you be like, oh my God, what's this woman doing? She said that in her opinion, all things come from the womb. People come from the womb of women. She says, so everything you think about around you, every invention, every success, every progression, it's all from the womb of woman. So she said that's why I chose to do interior scroll, is to have people think about that. The final essentialist I want to show you is Ana Mendieta, and she's very famous for her silhouette series or silhouette series. She was Cuban, and used a lot of like animism, as it's called, which is a part of a lot of indigenous Cuban religious ritual. And animism speaks to the idea of nature having energy, that nature has an energy within it, and it has sort of animal spirits within it and such, within the religious thinking. And so she's like, I wanted to think about the natural world and how I could use that to create these feminine images. And she said, if you think about it, women have really been equated with earth goddesses and Mother Earth. And so she was like, I was also pulling on that sense of Earth Mother kind of idea to create these works. And she's like, I wanted people to think about the overlap or the sort of identification of woman with nature. And is that fair? Or is that something that, again, women should reject, right? As being too basic, being too simplistic. So again, I think her works are interesting for saying, is it nature? Is it nurture? Like, what is it? Why are women the ones aligned with nature, not men? And the one on the right, the flowers on body, I always think is a very poignant piece because she made it a few years before her death. She actually died by falling out of a window in New York City. Her husband, Carl Andre, the minimalist sculptor, was actually tried for her death and acquitted. So some people suggest it wasn't an accident, that she fell from this window to her death. But I think it's sort of a odd piece to consider in light of the way that she died, and that it looks somewhat like a corpse, covered with flowers, more of like a funerary type of image.